Hey and welcome to Neverwinter with Aragon. So in this video, I'd like to give my tier list for module 32.5. With this update, we're getting new mount upgrades. We'll be able to get them to Celestial. What that means is our bolster gets increased, and therefore so do our mount combat powers. You can see this now has over 4,300 magnitude. This ultimately results in an increase to the amount of debuffs we have in an artifact call and the amount of burst damage we have. It will become more important than ever to balance your character around burst damage. These short 10-second windows, every about 60 seconds, that you do 4 to 5 times your normal amount of damage. So we will use this as a metric to rank the DPS. I will of course include my rankings of healers and tanks, particularly with Cleric now having some new improvements with module 32.5. Just be aware however, these are from my experiences playing the game. Perhaps you have something different, and also, even though some classes may be ranked higher than others, all classes in their current state has at least one paragon path that is fully viable in endgame. It's just some require a bit more effort than others, and yes, just looking at the raw numbers, some will have the potential to just output more damage than others. So we will use this to compare them and ultimately help rank them. So we'll first look at the Barbarian Sentinel. This is a tanking path, focused on making sure the enemies attack you and not your allies. In a boss fight, this is a standard setup you would use, with abilities to increase your threat, place you on top of that threat list, give you increased survivability, along with added team support effects here. It is in a very solid state, but I will put it in A tier and not S tier just because it's a little bit trickier to play. Not as easy as other tanks, but on a good skilled player, I would say it is S tier. But for the average player, I put it on A tier. Now we will have a look at the blademaster, the DPS path. You're focused on just dealing as much damage as possible. In terms of min-max burst damage, this is pretty much a setup you would use. This would be your artifact called rotation. So within a 10-second window, you want to cast all of these abilities, making use of one cavalry's haste and one tactician's precision to properly output those two sets of encounter powers. Using all of these abilities, I could calculate would net you 167 million damage using these buffs and all these team support effects within a dungeon, which is a 5-man party. Module 33 will bring a new dungeon and not a trial, and even then, the Soul Harvest trial, a lot of the time, it's basically like you're in a dungeon setting. So we will compare this 167 million versus the other classes here when we get to them, the other damage dealer classes. However, I cannot place Barbarian DPS very high on the tier list, primarily because it is a melee damage dealer and it will struggle versus other classes, at least in the relevant endgame content as of late, just because it's melee. I will also say, on top of it being melee, it's also kind of required to use animation cancelling to really optimize your damage output. Additionally, there's a lot of cases where you don't want to use escalating rage, despite it being able to increase your burst damage, and use relentless battle rage instead. This is much more reliable for sustained damage. But without this 25% boost, your burst damage drops to 149 million average damage in this rotation. So with all that in mind, I'm going to put Barbarian DPS in C tier. Next up we have the Bard, starting with the Minstrel Paragon path. You're a healer. Your role is to keep everybody alive, along with providing some extra team support. A usual boss fight setup would be this here. You ultimately rely a lot on your songs to provide that heal over time, those team support buffs. And compared to any other class, you are the best at boosting your team's effectiveness, increasing their damage and their survivability. There's no doubt the Bard healer remains top tier compared to everything, even with Cleric healer getting some pretty big boosts, at least from what we've seen so far. You have 100% uptime on boosts from Storyteller, Blaze Flamenco, and then a massive boost from Inspiration for artifact calls on 1 DPS, on top of having very solid heal over times plus clutch oh shit heals. And so yes, it belongs in S tier. We jump now though to the songblade, the DPS path for Bard. And for burst damage, this is in a really good spot. The changes to Lore Master have made it really powerful. The ability to gain that massive boost on your encounter powers, particularly for that artifact call, on top of extra team support effects, just to allow you to output massive damage. This is the rotation you can be using. You will need to have 1 Tactician's and 1 Cavalry's Haste insignia bonus, and we end up with over 180 million damage in just the artifact call, using these buffs and then all the team ones. Compared to Barbarian here, you can see it's a decent jump up in potential damage. The only real issue with this is its melee, and I would be tempted to drop it down a tier as a result. However, I will keep it in S tier for now. So next is the Cleric Devout. You're dedicated to keeping your allies alive by healing them, and you got some pretty cool buffs with this module. You now have the unique ability of actually being able to revive dead players. This can come in clutch. It's particularly for newer players. Maybe they didn't use a scroll, or they've already died 5 times and need that extra chance. You now have a lot of extra team support buffs here, being able to boost your team's damage output, which is really useful for endgame groups. This is a general setup you will use, and so with module 32.5, tempted to put it in S tier, particularly for newer players, but I think it'll still need to go in A tier, unless they increase the uptime on these buffs or boost the amount that they can give a bit further. But in terms of supporting newer players, these boosts are huge. All this damage resistance, even the extra recharge speed, and the ability to actually resurrect players. Completely new compared to the other healers. But now we'll jump to the DPS path, the Arbiter, focusing on just dealing maximum damage. In a boss fight, you'll generally use a setup like this, with a rotation like so. You really need to have 1400 divinity here. That's a combination of your expanded faith and arm pieces, which give you a boost of 25% maximum divinity. With this rotation and all your damage buffs, you should be able to output an average of upwards of 171 million in a dungeon party. This makes it a bit higher than Barbarian's potential, but a bit lower than Bard. You are, however, a ranged damage dealer. Have that to your advantage. However, the way it's balanced, around perfect balance, means if you make a misclick and you use one ability in the wrong order, you may end up not being able to continue rotation. So one misclick can completely ruin your damage from nearly S tier down to nothing. So I'll ultimately put Cleric DPS in B tier. Yes, it has the potential for a lot of damage, but the devs really need to give it a bit more quality of life, particularly with the fact one misclick can completely ruin your damage. And the fact you are heavily gear reliant. And to get this gear, you gotta be doing master content. But yeah, it has the potential for serious damage output. We now jump to the Vanguard, the fighter tank. This again, like a tank role, focuses on making sure the enemies attack you, along with providing them some team buffs. In a boss fight, this is the general setup you will use, with abilities, added stamina regen, increased threat, placing you on top of the threat list and also boosting your allies' damage through reducing the enemy's awareness, increased threat here as well. And ultimately, you have the ability to have an insane levels of threat, just really reliable, particularly through Knight's Valor, along with massive boost to stamina, because every tick of Knight's Valor will trigger this ability. And yeah, you can provide huge team support as well. You can enter your squat stats anytime, giving you huge stat boosts, along with an increase to the amount you can block. It is ultimately the super new player friendly class to play, and pretty much remains the top tier tank. So it goes in S tier. But now looking at the fighter dreadnought, so the DPS path for fighter. It uses abilities to maximize its damage output, and this is a general setup you will use in boss fights. Your rotation with 2 cavalries and 2 tacticians precision can look like this. It will allow you to output upwards of 141 million. I have looked at potentially alternate rotations and nothing really seems to be able to increase it much higher. Perhaps with some more optimal animation cancelling you might squeeze out 1 or 2 more hits, but nothing that's going to seriously boost its damage. So yeah, it seems pretty lacking when you compare its potential versus other classes. It's pretty far behind. On top of the fact it is a melee damage dealer, means you're going to struggle more than say a ranged damage dealer in the current endgame content. That means I unfortunately have to put fighter DPS in D tier. It does require animation cancelling to maximize its damage output, but even with that, its potential damage output is a bit lacking. It's ultimately not really a class I would play as a serious DPS player. There are just better options, but it can get the job done. Again, even if there are multiple tier differences between these classes, a full team of fighter DPS can get through the latest master content. It's not like the content's impossible to you, it just requires a bit more challenge and maybe a bit more time. So next we jump to Paladin, and we have the Oathkeeper Healer. This has the unique ability of providing massive shields to your allies. This is a general setup you will use, and again, you are literally the best healer to provide massive shields to everybody. With your Hand of Divinity, you can more than double their effective hit points, even on a tank. And this is a huge help for any newer tanks or any tough content where potential for your tank to die is there. Once your tank dies, the whole group falls apart. The one thing I would say it misses is really team support versus other options. Usually though, you pair Paladin with a Bard in a trial setting. In a dungeon, you may still want to take Paladin over Bard, again for a newer playthrough, when you just want to make sure you have as much survivability as possible. And that's what the Paladin is best at. Massive shields doubling everybody's hit points. So in terms of the tier list, yes, I'm pretty much just gonna have to put it in top tier as well. In terms of versatility and the ultimate endgame group, sure, it's not as good as Bard, particularly in a dungeon. But if you're new there, you don't mind taking a minute or 2 longer on a boss fight, and just want that added security of getting a completion, Paladin is the best bet here. At least one that is geared enough. But now we jump to the Justiciar, the Paladin tank. Again, uses its abilities to protect its allies and make sure the targets are attacking it instead of them. This is a general setup of abilities it will use, at least in a boss fight, using intimidating presence to have wide area threat generation, having abilities to massively reduce your allies' threat with the option to switch that to team support or even more damage, massive amounts of stamina regen, but you do have the limitation of divinity. And this will make you fall behind compared to some other tanks and just make it a little bit trickier to play. You don't necessarily have a full uptime whenever you want of your maximum block or area threat generation. So at least for the average player, I will put Paladin in A tier, and yes, because it lacks that team support that other tanks have, I would also put it a little bit behind the Barbarian tank. Consider anything to be to the left here a little bit better than what's on the right. I wouldn't necessarily put it a whole tier lower. And yeah, don't compare healers to tanks or DPS to tanks or healers, etc. Keep them isolated within their own, just look at their own ranks between them. Moving on to Ranger, we have the Warden path. This has the unique ability of basically twice as many abilities as any other class. Be aware you do have the Hunter path, which is also a damage dealer, with the same fact it has twice as many abilities. However, for this video we're just going to focus on Warden. Hunter has kind of fallen behind and needs some updates, but at least you have a Paragon path which can deal a ton of damage. Some of these abilities, looking at this one, might be a bit controversial to a regular Warden player, and that's because there's quite a few different ways you can play it. This is the rotation I recommend for the min-max setup, but it relies on having 2 gear pieces. This one from Master Soul Harvester, extra encounter power damage after you use a daily power, and this purple piece from the campaign store, also extra encounter damage after you use your daily power. I don't know if it's intended, and it could get changed at any time, so just keep a heads up, but whenever you trigger Forest Ghost, it has the effect as if you're casting 4 daily powers, at least in terms of you cast this and then 4 encounter powers, and those next 4 encounter powers, if cast quick enough, will all get boosted by those armor pieces. So I have 3 different setups here. One of them not using this, and we get nearly 140 million damage. Another using it, over 171 million. And then another rotation, switching, instead of using your throw caution and split the sky, you just use binding arrow and you get over 175 million. These are the 3 different rotations here, with ultimately the one where you cast oak skin at the start being the one with the binding arrow and where you could maximize your damage. Just due to it also triggers roots, and then it being buffed by these armor pieces means it's dealing a massive amount more damage, and just a bit more than if you were to use split the sky and throw caution, even though throw caution is going to boost all your damage by 15%. But that is additive and gets diminished, so just having this extra magnitude actually means you're dealing more damage. But compared to the other classes then, Warden looks really strong. The only drawback is, again, your melee. In most cases you need to be up close to your target to maximize your damage output. And also keep in mind this setup is for burst damage. You may just be better with a setup around Thorn Ward, Split the Sky, Throw Caution, Thorn Strike for overall average damage, but your burst damage will definitely take a hit. So in terms of where I would rank this, again this is Warden Ranger, I'm not going to rank the Hunter, it needs a lot of work. I'm going to put this in B tier. It has the potential, again, like even Cleric DPS, for a ton of damage, but it's very gear dependent, and it's melee. So B tier it is. Now we jump to the Rogue Whisperknife. Yes, you do have another path, which is the Rogue Assassin, but again, it just falls behind the Whisperknife. There just isn't real reason to play this. This is a setup you would use in boss fights, with the option to switch to smoke bomb instead of impact shot, particularly if there are some mobs. And this is your usual rotation, with 1 cavalry's haste and 1 tactician's mount bonus. The rotation is fairly straightforward, and you output a decent amount of damage. 160 million, fairly respectable. However, this 160 million does fall behind a little bit compared to the top classes, and despite having ranged abilities, you in most cases need to play in melee. With that in mind, I can't rank Rogue DPS particularly high. I will again put it in B tier. I would say it's a little bit better than Cleric, maybe even Warden, just because it's not gear dependent and the rotation is a lot more simple. You also have the added effect of stealth, which just makes you so much more survivable in any content that has extra mobs in boss fights, and a CC like Daze, which makes enemies not be able to attack you. But yeah, I'll put it in B tier here. Then we jump to Warlock, and we have the soulweaver healer. This one's a very mixed bag. You have a lot of abilities which are very useful, and you will switch between them depending on the fight. You have some solid heal over times. You even have the ability to switch all those heal over times to shields, but you won't be nearly as good as the Paladin. But you at least have the option, and in a trial setting, you're pretty flexible with what other healer you're paired with. You're ultimately pretty good at everything, but not really the best at anything. So in terms of its flexibility, I will put it in A tier. Its heal over times are nearly in line of Cleric. It even has some pretty solid team support, particularly having an armor piece that only it and the Bard can use to decrease the enemy's stats, increasing everybody's damage against it, which can make you pretty valuable in endgame groups. I would put it slightly behind the Cleric healer in terms of the Cleric getting its new buffs and new ability to resurrect people, but in terms of sheer effectiveness, I'll put them about on the same tier. Next up we have the Warlock DPS path, the Hellbringer. Lots of damage over time abilities, with the ability to summon a unique soul puppet. And what I found to be generally the best setup, unless your soul puppet's an idiot, would be this here. Although it can be, like Barbarian, a bit more reliable to use this ability for sustained damage rather than burst damage. And again, if your puppet's an idiot, risky investment can be better. And what I mean by that is the continued damage output of the soul puppet is pretty decent, but if they end up in a situation where they end up not being able to attack their target, you lose all that and you're just better off with this more reliable boost. This did get changed to be additive, so it's not multiplicative, not as good as before, and I have gone and compared multiple rotations. This is one here, and this is another. If we make the most of our daily power with tacticians, and then our mount power with cavalry's haste, we can squeeze out some extra encounter powers, min-maxing our damage output, and ultimately dealing a respectable amount. You also have the advantage of being a ranged DPS with a lot of damage over times, which does mean you'll have a decent amount of damage even if you gotta go play a mechanic. However, you do need to do animation cancelling right now. You can on PC take advantage of a keybind, but generally how you'll do animation cancelling is hold down the at wheel, hold down opposite movement keys, and then tap shift. Again, on PC, you can simply use a keybind for this, allowing you to spam this ability, generating a ton of soul sparks and some decent damage output. So in terms of tier, I'll put it in A tier. It is a very solid DPS right now. Yes, it doesn't have, say, the best burst damage, but it is fairly easy to play, and some pretty good survivability with your own heals from here. Again, outside of a burst setting, you may want to use Soul Spark Recovery for the extra cooldown to be able to spam out encounters a bit more often, but it is a bit trickier to play. And similarly, other players may debate that it can be better to use Risky Investment instead of Soul Desecration, but these were my findings on that here, why this was just better. So finally, we move on to Wizard, and we have the Thaumaturge path right here. There is the Arcanist path, but it has just really fallen behind, particularly with the introduction of Cavalry's Haste and Tactician's Precision. It really just can't keep up with Thaum. This is a general setup you will use for boss fights, with the potential of switching off Frigid Winds to Critical Burn, and if you want extra action point gain, you'll switch off Swath of Destruction and use Combustive Action instead. Sometimes it's better off to just use your multi-target daily power in boss fights when there's a lot of mobs instead of your single target one. But your rotation looks like this, with the requirement 2 Cavalry's Haste and 2 Tactician's Precision. This allows you to squeeze out 3 repels in your rotation. But in terms of calculated maximum damage, we're getting about 153 million, so just shy of what Warlock was getting. And this ultimately completes our list here of the DPS paragons, with a little chart to display how much of a difference is between them, at least via my potential average damage output, with an ideal rotation. We can sort that then here, and we find Bard is the best. But again, I'm not taking this as just gospel for a tier list, as there are other factors that influence how well you can actually practically output this amount of damage. But yeah, Wizard's super easy to play, pretty much in line with Warlock in terms of damage output, at least for burst damage, and this is where I put it. Potentially Warlock is a little bit better in terms of sustained damage, but yeah, I believe they pretty much go on the same tier here. I would still say Wizard's easier to play than Warlock. Warlock appears to have a longer animation time, and without animation cancelling, you'll probably struggle to squeeze all this into a 10-second artifact call, versus Wizard's a bit easier. Cast times are generally a bit lower. So yeah, ultimately I hope this was somewhat insightful in terms of the classes, rotations you'll want to use with them for boss fights, and of course these rankings will change if you're to go into multi-target content. But generally, boss fights is where your damage matters most, and so I'm fairly happy with these rankings. Again, don't be too put off by Barbarian and Fighter being as low as this. In terms of like a high skilled player, Barbarian could be upwards of A tier, and Fighter potentially C, maybe B tier. in the current state of things, with them being melee, mechanics causing them to have a lot lower uptime on damage output, along with the fact they require animation cancelling to really maximize their damage, I think it's justified at these tiers. But of course, feel free to leave your opinions in the comments below, what you think otherwise, how you'd rank them differently. Just keep in mind that my tier list is based off burst damage, maximum damage output you could do within, say, an artifact call, with also keeping in mind how easy it is to realistically play those classes. So with that said, thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys around.